When my daughter told me I was a burden, I did not shout. I did not raise my voice or defend myself the way younger people do when they feel cornered. I did not remind her of the years I stayed awake when she was sick, or the mornings I skipped breakfast so she could have new school shoes. I did not cry in front of her either, even though my chest tightened so suddenly it felt like something inside me had cracked open. I simply smiled. I smiled the way women of my generation were taught to smile, when pain was not something you were allowed to show. It was the kind of smile that sits gently on your lips while your heart quietly collapses behind it. A smile that says, I hear you, even when what you are hearing is something that will echo in your mind long after the room has gone silent. A smile that hides tears not because you are strong, but because you are tired of explaining your worth to people who no longer see it. She stood there in front of me with her arms crossed tightly across her chest, leaning against the doorway of the room I slept in. Not my room, really, just a small room at the end of the hallway, the one with the weakest light and the smallest window. The room she had decided was suitable for me after she and her husband moved in, the room I was expected to be grateful for. And as she stood there, blocking the doorway as if she needed to remind herself that this space belonged to her now, I felt something heavy settle deep inside my bones. She avoided my eyes when she spoke. I noticed that first. Her voice was careful, practiced, like someone repeating lines they had rehearsed many times in their head. She said, Mom, this situation can't go on forever. We need our space. You're becoming too much. Too much. That phrase landed between us and stayed there, thick and heavy, filling the room like smoke. Too much space, too much time, too much need, too much age, too much existence. I let the words sit, because responding felt like lifting something far heavier than my body could carry in that moment. I looked around slowly, letting my eyes trace the walls of the room, walls I had once chosen with care when the house was first built. I remembered standing in a dusty showroom with my husband decades earlier, arguing softly about paint shades while our children tugged at our sleeves. I looked at the curtains, the ones I had bought with my own money, measured and stitched to fit these very windows, long before my daughter ever imagined living here again. I looked at the floor, remembering the day I paid the workers to polish it until it shone, proud that we could finally afford something nice after years of making do. And still, I nodded, not because I agreed with her, but because I knew something. She'd in something that had been quietly settling into place long before this conversation ever happened. Something that made arguing feel unnecessary, almost pointless. You see, the house she was standing in did not truly belong to her, not in the way she believed, not in the way she spoke about it to her husband at night when she thought I was asleep, not in the way she talked about their future and their plans while sitting at the table I had bought and the chairs I had repaired again and again so the legs would not wobble. Not yet, and maybe not ever. My husband had died quietly in his sleep 2 years earlier. There was no warning, no dramatic final goodbye. One moment he was there, breathing softly beside me, and the next he was gone, leaving a space in the bed that felt far too wide for just one person. After the funeral, after the neighbors stopped knocking on the door with casseroles wrapped in foil, after the phone calls slowed and then stopped, I was left alone with my thoughts for the first time in my life. Truly alone. In that quiet, something became very clear to me. Grief has a way of stripping life down to its bare bones, and what remains is the truth you can no longer avoid. I saw my children differently then, not as the small hands I once held while crossing busy streets, but as adults watching closely, measuring, waiting. I noticed how conversations changed, how questions about my health slowly turned into questions about paperwork, about deeds, about a counsel. I rewrote my will, not in anger, not in revenge, but in clarity. I sat at a small desk with papers spread out before me, my husband's photograph nearby, his gentle smile reminding me of the promises we once made to protect each other and what we built. I thought carefully about kindness, about respect, about who showed up, not because they expected something, but because they cared. And when I was finished, the will did not say what my children believed it said. That is why, months later, when my 3 children sat in my living room, voices raised, faces tight with tension, arguing over my jewelry, my house, and my pension, like strangers fighting at a market stall, I said nothing. I sat quietly in my chair, hands folded in my lap, listening as if I were invisible. They talked over each other, interrupting, claiming memories that suited them, rewriting promises that were never made. They spoke about my things as if I were already gone, as if my life had already ended and all that remained was the sorting of what I left behind, and I stayed silent, because none of them were the main heirs. Someone else was, and in that silence, in that moment where my voice was no longer needed, I felt a strange calm settle over me, not sadness, not fear, just the quiet certainty that sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is smile, listen, and let the truth wait for its own time to be revealed. I raised 3 children, 2 daughters and 1 son. When I say I raised them, I do not mean I simply brought them into the world and watched them grow on their own. I mean, I poured my entire life into them, day by day, year by year, without keeping count of what it cost me. I raised them in this very house, the same house they would one day sit in and argue over as if it were already a prize waiting to be claimed. Every corner of it holds a memory of their childhood, of scraped knees, late-night fevers, laughter echoing down the hallway, and arguments that ended with slammed doors and silent apologies the next morning. Their father and I worked hard, but it was not rich work. We did not have fancy jobs or impressive titles. It was honest work, the kind that wears down your body slowly, but gives you the quiet pride of knowing you earned every single thing you own. He fixed machines at a factory, coming home most days, with oil on his hands and exhaustion in his eyes. I worked part-time when the children were small, then full-time when they were old enough to stay home alone after school. I learned to stretch time and money the way other women learn to stretch dough, carefully and patiently, never wasting a single piece. Every paycheck went to them, not some of it, not most of it, all of it. There were weeks when I wore the same old shoes because one of them needed new ones for school. There were months when I delayed going to the dentist because a child needed braces. School clothes were bought first, always. Shoes came before anything I wanted. Dentist visits were scheduled even when it meant juggling bills and praying the car would not break down that month. Birthday cakes were homemade, sometimes lopsided, always sweet, with too much sugar and candles that bent over from the heat before we could finish singing. I remember those birthdays clearly. I remember how their eyes lit up even when the gifts were simple. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late at night, wrapping presents quietly so I would not wake them, feeling tired but deeply content. I remember thinking, this is what my life is for. I was not a perfect mother. I lost my patience sometimes. I raised my voice when fear came out as anger. I made mistakes I still think about late at night when sleep refuses to come, but I was a present one. I showed up, I listened, I tried. I was there when they were sick, when they were scared, when they were disappointed, when they failed, and when they succeeded. I stood in the crowd at school events, clapping until my hands hurt. I sat at the edge of their beds during storms, telling them stories so they would not be afraid of the thunder. For many years, that felt like enough. Then their father passed away. And something changed, not in me, in them. His death was quiet, but his impact was not. After the funeral, after the house filled, and then slowly emptied of people offering condolences, I noticed the shift almost immediately. At first it was subtle, small changes in tone, longer pauses before answering questions, glances exchanged when they thought I was not looking. But I told myself it was grief, that everyone handles loss differently, and I tried to be patient. At first they were gentle. They checked on me more often. They asked if I was eating, if I was sleeping, if I needed anything. They called me Mom, with a softness in their voices that made me believe we were closer than ever. I was grateful for that attention. I was lonely, and their concern felt like a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. But slowly, almost without me noticing at first, concern turned into calculation. The questions changed. They were no longer about how I felt, but about what I had. My oldest daughter was the first to suggest I sell the house and downsize, saying it would be easier for me, safer, more practical. She spoke as if she were doing me a favor, as if letting go of the home I built my life in would be a relief rather than another loss. My son started asking about my pension, saying he just wanted to understand things, just in case. He used careful words, gentle words, but his eyes were too focused, too alert. My youngest daughter moved in with her husband and said it would be temporary. just until they saved enough, just until they figured things out. She promised they would not be a burden, that they would help around the house, that it would only be for a short while. Temporary became permanent without anyone ever saying so out loud. Suddenly, I was no longer the woman who owned the house. I was the guest. I waited for bathroom turns in the morning, standing quietly in my robe while my daughter and her husband got ready for work. I asked before cooking, careful not to use ingredients they might have plans for. I kept my television volume low so it would not disturb them, even though I used to watch my favorite shows freely in my own living room. I started apologizing for things that did not require apologies. For being in the way, for taking too long, for existing in spaces that were once unquestionably mine. I learned to move softly through my own home, like a visitor who did not want to overstay her welcome. And then one day, during a conversation that felt ordinary until it suddenly wasn't, my daughter said the word burden. She did not shout it. She did not say it with anger. She said it carefully, almost kindly, as if she were explaining a simple fact rather than delivering a wound. That was the day something inside me finally grew quiet. Not angry, not broken, just quiet. It was the day I understood the love I had given freely all my life was now being measured, weighed, and found inconvenient. And in that quiet, I began to see my life, my sacrifices, and my children with a clarity I had never allowed myself before. The house changed after that day. Not in ways you could easily point to or explain to someone standing outside looking in. The walls did not move. The furniture stayed where it always had been. The pictures of family smiles still hung on the walls, frozen in happier times. But the feeling inside the house shifted quietly and steadily. Like a slow leak you do not notice until the floor is already soaked. The air felt heavier. Conversations softened or stopped altogether when I entered a room. Laughter that flowed easily when I was not present would suddenly fade, replaced by polite silence or forced smiles. I could sense it immediately, the way one senses a change in weather before the clouds appear. I would walk into the kitchen, and voices would trail off mid-sit and someone would clear their throat. Someone else would suddenly remember something they needed to do in another room. But bills began appearing on the table in front of me, neatly stacked, placed there with heavy sighs that were meant to be heard. No one directly accused me of anything, but the message was clear. Electricity costs were rising. Water bills were higher than before. Groceries were more expensive these days. These facts were repeated often, casually, but always within earshot. It was as if every number, every receipt, carried my name written on it in invisible ink. They started keeping track. Not openly, not with notebooks or lists, but with looks and comments that made me aware of every small thing I did. How many cups of tea I drank in a day. How long I stayed in the shower. How often I turned on the heater when my bones ached from the cold. Each action seemed to carry weight now, as if my presence came with a cost they were no longer willing to pay quietly. So I began shrinking myself, slowly, carefully, without anyone ever asking me to. I ate less, choosing smaller portions, so no one could say I was using too much food. I talked less, afraid that my words might be seen as complaints or interruptions. I asked for nothing, not even when my body ached or my head felt foggy. I learned to sit very still in my chair, hands folded, eyes lowered, as if making myself smaller would somehow make me easier to live with. But time does not stop for anyone, no matter how quietly they try to exist. My health began to fail in small, unremarkable ways. At first, I needed help standing after sitting too long. I forgot appointments or misplaced things more often than I used to. My legs felt weaker, my balance uncertain. These were not dramatic changes, just the slow signs of age, the kind every person reaches if they are lucky enough to live long. Patience disappeared. The same people who once checked if I was eating now sigh when I moved too slowly. The same voices that once spoke gently now carried sharp edges when they had to repeat themselves. Help was given, but reluctantly, with visible frustration, as if each request confirmed a fear they did not want to name out loud. One evening, as I sat quietly in my room, I heard my daughter whisper to her husband. She thought I couldn't hear. People often think age dulls the senses, but some things become clearer than ever. Her voice was low, tired, almost resentful. She said, "She's living longer than we expected." The words did not shock me at first. They settled in slowly, sinking deep before their meaning fully revealed itself. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the room dark and silent, and I cried softly into my pillow. I cried in the careful way you do when you don't want anyone to hear, when you don't want to cause trouble, when you have learned that your pain makes others uncomfortable. I did not cry because of the words themselves. Words can be explained away, denied, softened. I cried because of what they meant. They meant my life had been measured against expectations that no one ever shared with me. They meant my continued existence had become an inconvenience. They meant the love I once believed was unconditional had quietly turned into ownership, into waiting, into entitlement. In that moment, something inside me finally broke free from illusion. I realized I was no longer seen as their mother, the woman who raised them, protected them, and gave them everything she had. I was no longer a person whose presence held value on its own. I was an obstacle, standing between them and what they believed was already theirs. And still, they assumed everything I owned would one day belong to them. The house, the savings, the memories, tied up in objects they had already begun dividing in their minds. They spoke about the future as if it had already been decided, as if my role in it was simply to fade quietly and leave my things behind. Listened, I watched, and with each passing day, the truth became clearer. Love had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It had slowly turned into expectation, into calculation, into waiting for something that required my absence to be complete.
The fight happened on a Sunday, the kind of Sunday that used to mean warmth and togetherness, the kind that once smelled like slow-cooked food and sounded like familiar laughter drifting from room to room. Sundays used to be sacred in our house. They were the one day everyone slowed down, the one day when work worries stayed outside and family filled the space instead. But that Sunday felt different from the moment I woke up. The air was tense, heavy, as if the house itself knew something painful was about to unfold. All three of my children were there, sitting in the living room where they had grown up. The same living room where they once sprawled on the floor with toys, where they fought over television shows, where they curled up beside their father on the couch when they were tired or scared. Now they sat upright, stiff, their bodies angled toward one another like opponents rather than family. Their voices were already sharp before the real argument even began. My jewelry box sat on the table between them. It was an old wooden box, scratched and worn, holding pieces collected over a lifetime. None of it was especially valuable in a market sense, but every piece carried a memory. A necklace my husband bought me after our first difficult year. A ring passed down from my own mother. Simple earrings worn on ordinary days that mattered only because life was happening then. Beside the box lay the papers to the house, carefully stacked, official and cold, bearing names and dates that suddenly seemed to matter more than the person still breathing in the room. They talked as if I wasn't even there. Not quietly, not cautiously, but openly, confidently, as if my presence had already been erased. The words came fast, overlapping, each one louder than the last. One of my daughters said, "She always said the necklace was mine," her voice firm, her hand already hovering over the jewelry box as if ownership had already been decided. My son shook his head, irritation clear on his face, and replied, "No, Dad promised me the house. He said it years ago." My other daughter leaned forward, her tone sharp and practical, and asked, "What about the pension? That should be split equally. It's only fair." I sat there in my chair, hands folded neatly in my lap, my body very still. I watched their mouths move, watched words spill out without pause, without reflection. I watched their faces harden as each one defended what they believed belonged to them. I saw familiar expressions twisted into something I barely recognized. The warmth I once saw in their eyes had been replaced by entitlement, by certainty, by impatience. No one asked me what I wanted. No one looked at me. I was there, breathing, listening, feeling every word press against my chest, and still I was invisible. It was as if I had already died in their minds, as if my role in their lives had already ended, leaving only the task of dividing what remained. As they argued, memories flooded me without warning. I remembered the nights I stayed awake waiting for them to come home safely. I remembered the meals I skipped so there would be enough for everyone else. I remembered the way I held each of them as bobbies, marveling at how something so small could completely change my world. And now here they were, grown, strong, confident, speaking of my life's belongings as if they were prizes to be claimed. The room grew louder, the tension sharper. Old grievances surfaced, wrapped in the language of inheritance. Accusations flew about favoritism, about promises made and broken, about who deserved what more. They argued over words spoken decades earlier, twisting memories to suit their needs, each one certain their version was the truth. I realized then that nothing I said would matter. If I spoke, I would interrupt their plans. If I corrected them, I would become difficult. If I reminded them I was still alive, it would only make them uncomfortable. So I stayed silent. In that silence, something inside me settled into place. I felt no urge to defend myself, no need to justify my choices. Instead, I felt a quiet certainty, calm and steady. That was the moment I knew, without doubt, that I had done the right thing rewriting my will. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of respect for myself. Because love that counts your death before it happens is not love. Love does not wait for you to disappear so it can finally claim what you leave behind. Love does not measure your worth by what you own or how soon it might be inherited. Love sees you, listens to you, values you while you are still here. As their voices rose and fell, as the argument circled endlessly around objects and money, I felt strangely peaceful. They believed they were deciding my future, but in truth, my future had already been decided. The papers lying on the table did not tell the full story. The will they assumed existed was not the one I had written. I watched them argue until their words blurred together, until the noise became distant, like a radio playing in another room. In that moment, I understood something deeply and clearly. The most painful part was not that they wanted what I owned. It was that they no longer saw me as a person, only as a passage to something else. And still, I remained quiet. Because sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the final space where dignity still lives, waiting patiently for the truth to reveal itself when the time is right. I stayed quiet that day. I did not interrupt their argument. I did not raise my hand or clear my throat or remind them that I was still sitting there, still breathing, still very much alive. I stayed quiet, not because I was weak, and not because I had nothing to say, but because I was free in a way I had not been free for a very long time. There's a kind of freedom that comes when you finally stop needing to be understood by people who have already decided who you are to them. That was the freedom I felt settle into my chest that afternoon, calm and steady, like a deep breath I had been holding for years without realizing it. They believed my silence meant agreement or confusion or fear. They believed it meant I was tired or overwhelmed or too old to follow the conversation. What they did not understand was that my silence came from certainty. I had already made my choices. I had already faced the truth of who stood beside me out of love and who stood near me only out of expectation. The decisions that mattered most had been made quietly, carefully, with a clear mind and a steady hand, long before this argument ever took place. I had already chosen who would inherit my home. That house was more than walls and a roof. It was the place where my life unfolded, where love lived in ordinary moments, where sacrifices were made without applause. I wanted it to belong to someone who understood that, someone who respected the weight of what it represented. I had already chosen who would receive my savings, not because they needed it the most, but because they valued me beyond it. And most importantly, I had already chosen to honor the person who showed me kindness without ever expecting a reward in return. And it was not the children arguing in front of me. That realization did not bring me anger. It did not bring bitterness or a desire for revenge. What it brought me was peace. A deep, unexpected peace that wrapped around me like a warm shawl on a cold evening. For the first time in years, I felt calm in my own body. My shoulders relaxed. My breath slowed. The constant tightness I had grown used to, the feeling of being on edge in my own home, began to loosen its grip. After that day, I moved through the house differently. Not louder, not bolder, but lighter. I no longer felt the need to explain myself or justify my presence. I no longer counted how much space I took up or how much I cost. I drank my tea without guilt. I rested when my body needed rest. I spoke when I wanted to speak, and I remained silent when silence felt right. Something inside me had shifted, and once it did, it could not be undone. I thought often about my life, about the long road that led me here. I thought about the young woman I once was, full of hope and energy, building a life brick by brick with a man who loved me deeply. I thought about the mother I became, pouring everything I had into raising children who would grow into people I barely recognized in moments like these. I realized that I had spent most of my life giving, adjusting, bending, believing that love meant sacrifice without limits. And while love does require sacrifice, it should never require erasing yourself. As the days passed, I stopped waiting for them to change. I stopped hopping for apologies that would never come or realizations that might arrive too late to matter. Instead, I focused on myself, on the quiet joys that still existed. Morning light through the window, the comfort of familiar routines, the peace of knowing my affairs were in order, my wishes clear, my voice preserved in ink where it could not be ignored or spoken over. I finally understood something important, something I wish I had understood sooner but was grateful to understand at all. I was never a burden. Not then. Not now. Not ever. The years I lived, the love I gave, the work I did, all of it had value simply because it existed. My worth was never tied to how useful I was to others or how little I asked for in return. It was never dependent on how quietly I aged or how quickly I disappeared. I was just living among people who forgot, who built the ground beneath their feet. They forgot the hands that laid the foundation they now stood on. They forgot the nights spent worrying, the days spent working, the dreams set aside so theirs could grow. They forgot that nothing they were arguing over would exist without the life that came before them. Forgetting that did not make them evil. It made them human, flawed, impatient, and blinded by entitlement. But their forgetting did not erase my truth. And my truth was this: I had lived a full life. I had loved deeply. I had given generously. And in the end, I chose to honor myself in the quietest, strongest way I knew how. That knowledge stayed with me, steady and comforting. It carried me through long evenings and quiet mornings. It reminded me, again and again, that peace does not come from being needed. It comes from being whole.